Hello, my name is Joanne Pariseau. On behalf of the Goodrich Memorial Library, I welcome you to our Snapshot event, Reproductive Rights and Justice in the 1970s and Today, with UVM History Professor Felicia Kornbluh. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We extend our thanks to our patrons, our partners rather, at the Vermont Humanities, as well as the generous underwriters who make it possible for us to offer such a rich and robust programming. The sponsor of our entire Snapshot season is the Vermont Department of Libraries, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the Alma Gibbs Donsion Foundation. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Ann Kohlmeyer Fund for Women in the Humanities. Tonight we come together from across the state to listen, to learn, and to be inspired in community. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping things. Next week at this time, we have author Diana Henry, her, and then we will parler en français. Yes. So, now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Felicia Kornbluh, is a professor of history and of gender, sexuality, and women's studies, an affiliated member in Jewish studies at the University of Vermont. Her third book, A Woman's Life is a Human's Life, My Mother, Our Neighbor, and the Journey from Reproductive Rights to Reproductive Justice, appeared in paperback in January 2024. A Woman's Life was described in the New York Times as comprehensive, compelling chronicle, and by the Pulitzer Prize-winning legal scholar David Garrow as essential reading for these harrowing days. Without further ado, Dr. Kornbluh. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thanks so much. So I will lecture a little on the short side so that we can maybe have a conversation and so that I can also learn what's of interest to you all. Go ahead to the next slide. So the talk is built around this book I published originally in January 2023, and which just came out in paperback in January of this year. A Woman's Life is a Human Life, My Mother, Our Neighbor, and the Journey from Reproductive Rights to Reproductive Justice. So I'll just start by defining the terms and talking about the title. When I talk about these terms, these are words that are used mostly in the advocacy world and to some degree in the kind of women's studies, academic world as well. So, forgive me if this is familiar to you, but I'll just run through it so everybody knows what we're talking about. So first, when we talk about reproductive rights, on the one hand, generally speaking, what people use that term to mean access to abortion, to legal, safe, accessible abortion care or services, and access to birth control or contraception. So the purpose of that is to describe all of the things that somebody might want or might need if they were deciding not to have a child, right? It's the choice to not bear or raise a child. And when we talk about decriminalizing abortion, which is the kind of the centerpiece of the story that I tell in the 1960s and 1970s as the heart of the reproductive rights movement, people use that phrase decriminalize because abortion in the United States didn't used to be a crime. It wasn't a legislative crime or a statutory crime. There was some language about abortion in the common law, the old common law that came from England, right? But even under the common law, it was pretty loose and pretty forgiving, right? The standard under the common law was there was no crime, there was no problem until the fetus would kick. It was called the quickening, the period of the quickening, which modern scholars and doctors would say is around 20 weeks maybe into a pregnancy, 18 to 23 weeks of a pregnancy. So pretty far into a pregnancy. Up until that point, common law pretty much had nothing to say about abortion. And even after that point, it was kind of up to the person who was pregnant to say whether or not the quickening had happened or not, right? Because nobody else could say, oh, the baby kicked. She was the only one who could feel the baby kick, the embryo or the fetus, moving in her body. It was actually more forgiving or looser in the earlier period, and then in the 19th century, it became a crime, right? There was an organized movement of doctors and other kinds of moralistic activists who made it a crime. And the people I'm writing about, the reproductive rights activists in the 60s and 70s, were people who basically said, this is something that never should have been a crime in the first place, and they were starting to imagine a time when it would no longer be a crime, right? They were looking at this 100-year period when it had been criminalized and saying, we can and we should bring this to an end. And that was what the work that they were trying to do in the 20th century. So that's reproductive rights on one hand. On the other hand, we use this term reproductive justice. And different people have slightly different definitions of that, but basically when we talk about that, we're talking about a much bigger possible agenda, kind of an aspirational agenda, which would certainly include abortion and birth control, but people also try to imagine, well, what would be required for people to make really free choices about whether to have a child? So it wouldn't just be that you would want to have access to contraception and abortion, but also being able to say with some certainty that you're going to have the economic ability to raise a child, having access to the healthcare, the prenatal healthcare and the postnatal healthcare and nutrition and all of those things. It turns out there's a pretty long list of things that somebody might need or want if they were really going to make a free choice, right, or an unencumbered choice about whether or not to have a child. So activists in the field and scholars have developed this idea of reproductive justice that just goes a lot further than abortion and contraception. And it might include, a whole laundry list of things that would require pretty significant changes in the way people live. We would need to have safe neighborhoods so that people could say, I feel okay about having a child because my child will be able to be raised in safety and not be harassed by the police, and so on. So what I'm doing in the book is I'm talking about the somewhat different trajectories of the movement for reproductive rights and the movement for reproductive justice, how they overlap in certain ways, but then also how they depart from each other. And my overall argument, if there is one, is that really these are things that should be inseparable, right? We should always think of them together. Of course, we should be talking about, the bare legal minimum, which is not available to everybody today. I know that. The bare legal minimum of people being able to access services. But then beyond that, I think we should always be in a conversation about what more can we provide? How much more can we make it possible for people to make genuinely free choices and choices that they're happy with about, with whom they're going to have a child and when they're going to have a child, whether they're going to have a child, right? All of those things, which might require our society to actually do a lot of work. Okay, next slide. So on the reproductive rights side of the page, the first person I talk about in the book is my own mother. And she's in the subtitle too, my mother, our neighbor. So my mother, who died in 2017, Beatrice Kornbluh Braun, that's her in the hat and the skirt suit. And what she's doing in this photo is she's representing a woman criminal defendant in the night court that they used to have in New York City. I think the woman that she was represented was accused of being a prostitute. And this was a photo that ran in a local newspaper, I think because the photographer thought it was so extraordinary, and probably thought it was kind of funny or something, that there was a woman criminal defendant and a woman attorney. Right, my mother graduated from law school in 1954, at a time when 4% of the American legal profession was female, And one of the ways that I think about that and how early that was is that it was before Ruth Bader Ginsburg graduated from law school. And if you saw any of the Ginsburg movies or anything, where she talks about being such a minority as a woman in law school and kind of being harassed, so my mother graduated from law school earlier than that. And she made her way first working for small firms and ultimately for labor unions, and then for the federal government agency, the National Labor Relations Board that manages unions and union elections. And in her free time, which she didn't have very much of, because she also had 3 young children, and I'm a twin, so she had 2 babies at the same time. But in what free time she could find, my mother became a very early member of the National Organization for Women, and particularly of its New York City chapter, which was its first local chapter and kind of its premier chapter. And as it happened, my mom joined the Committee on Contraception and Abortion of her local chapter of the National Organization for Women, and she was the only lawyer on that committee. So it became her job to try and embody and represent the National Organization for Women position on abortion in a piece of actual legislation. They thought she would know how to write it in the proper legal language. And so what my mom did was she went through the entire legal code of the state of New York. And there were no computers, of course, right? So she went through page by page, and she found every mention of abortion that was in the state legal code. And she created a draft legislation, a piece of draft legislation that would simply have removed abortion entirely from the state code. Just take it out. And what that would have meant was that every person who had the capacity to get pregnant would just be able to make a free choice, right? Government would have nothing to say on the matter. And of course, people might, talk to their doctor or their clergy, or certainly to their partners, to their spouses or their lovers, and they would, take into consideration their family circumstances, but they wouldn't be obliged, right, by the law to talk to anybody in particular. And it certainly wouldn't be a government agency that was deciding whether you were allowed or you were not allowed to seek out an abortion procedure. And that, in fact, was the bill that was introduced into the legislature in the state of New York in January of 1969. Next slide. So in here, this is an amazing document that I found. I found the actual design of the legislation and this letter that accompanied it, which was to our local state assemblyman, a guy named Franz Leichter, in which already, even before Leichter and his co-sponsor had introduced the bill in New York, Leichter was already getting cold feet, and he was saying, we can't do anything this radical, maybe through 24 weeks of a pregnancy or something, and not through the whole entirety of a pregnancy would somebody be able to make this choice. And in this letter, my mother is talking him down, basically talking him off the ledge and saying, no. We need to have a legislation that gives people complete, free autonomy and free choice in this matter. And my mother's position, which is really interesting, if you consider it today, is that she thinks that would even be a more appealing position to people who are philosophically opposed to abortion and people who are religiously opposed to abortion, because at least the government isn't going to be in the business of saying this person deserves it and this person doesn't deserve it, right? And this, embryo or this fetus is, has this, diagnosis, and so therefore it's acceptable, right? It would just get the government out of the business of making those choices. So then, if people who had religious or philosophical objections, they would make choices in line with those, with their philosophy. But it wouldn't be the government sort of putting its thumb on the scale and saying, this one is good, this one is bad. So that was my mother's position, and she was able to talk him into kind of sticking with his guns, and they did introduce that bill. And it was by far the most liberal abortion legislation that had ever been introduced in the history of the United States, and probably in the history of the Western world, as far as my research has been able to uncover. That wasn't what actually passed. What actually passed was still by far the most liberal abortion law in the United States at the time, and it passed 3 years before Roe versus Wade. So it was a real precedent for Roe. But they did ultimately negotiate down from the kind of absolute choice or absolute liberty to the 24-week period, which is roughly the 2 trimesters of a pregnancy, and Roe versus Wade breaks up a pregnancy into 3 trimester periods. So it's roughly the 2 out of 3 trimester point. So yeah, that was where they negotiated down to. And the principle they never gave up on in New York, which wound up being really transformative, was that there was no residency requirement. So, and there are still people in Vermont who remember this, so that when the state of New York changed its abortion laws in the spring of 1970, suddenly people could come from anywhere in the country. And they didn't have to be New York residents. They didn't have to stay in New York for any extended period of time, right? So actually, there were activists here and in many places who took it upon themselves to help people get across the border to New York, right? When they felt like they needed or wanted an abortion, and people came from actually all 50 states to New York before Roe versus Wade, and they were able to get safe abortion procedures, which were legal. Before Roe, they were legal, totally legal, and difficult. I'm sure it was hard to get to New York if you live far away and stuff like that. But at least you didn't have to run the risk of having an illegal and potentially really unsafe procedure. That's what this New York law did. And what I argue in the book is, on the one hand, it's important in itself because it opened things up in a very substantial way, and it showed that abortions could be provided to many, many people safely on a large scale. But also, I think it was a precedent for Roe, especially because it created the situation where people from all over the country were getting access to this, right? And it became sort of a class privilege for, if somebody could afford the airfare or something to get to New York, then they could get it, and if not, they couldn't. And I think that I have only kind of trace evidence of this, but I think that was one of the reasons why the Supreme Court ultimately decided that they needed to resolve this case and this issue. All right, next slide. The other person who's really important in my story is somebody who was actually our next door neighbor for about a decade. And she represents what I'm calling the reproductive justice side of things. Meaning that she was, of course, pro-choice in terms of abortion and contraception, but she also started to articulate for herself and for a lot of people this bigger agenda, this bigger kind of reproductive justice agenda. Her name was Helen Rodriguez Trias. She was a Puerto Rican woman who kind of had lived on both the island of Puerto Rico and on the U.S. mainland and in New York City. She was about the same age as my mom. Although she had a somewhat different model of how she got trained as a professional. A lot of women in that generation, they had their kids first, and then they went back to school. So that was kind of her model. She had 3 children, and then she went back and she finished her college degree, and then she went on to medical school. And she became very effective working in neonatology and bringing down the deaths of newborns at the University of Puerto Rico Hospital. But her politics quickly kind of moved to the left. As a Puerto Rican woman, she became an activist and was sort of fighting the U.S. role on the island of Puerto Rico. So she identified very strongly with that movement. And then from that starting point, that was the place from which she became a reproductive justice, as I call it, activist. She moved to New York City when her marriage broke up, and she became the head of the Department of Pediatrics at probably the worst hospital in the city of New York, one of the worst in the country, this hospital called Lincoln Hospital, which had recently been taken over by a Puerto Rican militant group called the Young Lords, which is sort of the equivalent of the Black Panther Party, but in the Puerto Rican community. And they occupied the hospital. They made a series of demands about how they wanted the hospital to respond to their community. And one of their demands was that they didn't want there to be what they were calling sterilization abuse at the hospital. And so that was kind of a wake-up call for Dr. Rodriguez Trias to discover that in this hospital that she was working in, people were alleging that there was sterilization abuse, that people were being coerced or persuaded to have sterilization procedures when they didn't really want them and when maybe that wasn't appropriate for them. And that, just the backstory is, on the island of Puerto Rico itself, sterilization had become a primary means of contraception. Abortion was illegal, and it was very, very hard for somebody to get an abortion if they were Puerto Rican and if they were, actually from Puerto Rico. If you were wealthy and you were from like New York City or Boston or Burlington, Vermont, and you wanted to go down to Puerto Rico and you could afford it, you could probably get an abortion, but not if you were local and, working class or poor or something like that. So the government in Puerto Rico and the US government decided that people should have sterilization as a primary means of contraception, and that abortion was still going to be inaccessible to them. So you have a situation where by the end of the 60s, 35% of Puerto Rican women of reproductive age have had sterilization procedures, 35%. So it's happening on the island. People who are, attuned to those issues allege that it's happening even in New York City at this hospital that's in one of the poorest neighborhoods. That's a very heavily Puerto Rican and Black neighborhood. And then the final straw is there's a woman named Carmen Rodriguez, not related to Rodriguez Trias, who actually dies in this hospital that she works at from an abortion procedure. And it's not because abortion is illegal by that point. It's just because this is such a bad hospital. And so she's the first person to die after the law changes, like after abortion becomes legal, or almost entirely legal in New York. And it becomes a kind of teaching moment, a wake-up call, if you will, where Rodriguez Trias, who's this compassionate doctor, sees that, for some of the people that her hospital is serving, the key issue is not even whether it's legal or whether it's illegal. Right? The question is, what's the quality of services that people are getting? Do they have attentive medical care? Right? Doctors who really read their chart and understand. Like, this was a woman she had an allergic reaction to something she was given while she was having the procedure. So that became a center of organizing all in itself in the neighborhood. And it was really an instructive moment for this young doctor who was having her first administrative job as the head of pediatrics at this terrible, terrible hospital. Next slide. So a couple of years later, Rodriguez Trias and friends, you can see her, the people that she's hanging out with this time, most of them a lot younger than her, they decide that what they're going to do about this issue of sterilization abuse is to form their own dedicated organization that's just going to work on that problem, the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse. And it's made up of lots of different groups of people. There's some Puerto Ricans affiliated with the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, which is a pro-independence party. There are white leftists, including leftist feminists. And what they start to do is they link the issue of sterilization abuse in Puerto Rico with what's happening on the U.S. mainland, and they start to articulate a kind of political agenda, and to say that even when abortion is legal, right, that's not enough. It's not enough for the people who are experiencing sterilization abuse. It's not enough for low-income people who don't have access to good health care, and so on. And those are the issues that they start to go after. And they have a series of really remarkable successes. First, they get the New York City Public Hospitals, the Health and Hospitals Corporation, to change their guidelines for sterilization so that hopefully people won't be pressured into it. Then they get the whole city of New York via the New York City Council to change their guidelines in 1976. And interestingly, their biggest opposition, the people on the other side, are kind of the classic feminist groups, the classic reproductive rights groups. The National Organization for Women, my mom's organization, and Planned Parenthood are on the other side. And it's a really interesting conflict because I think the activists on the other side are afraid that if you make it more difficult for somebody to get any kind of reproductive medical care, even something like sterilization, right? If you put in new guidelines that make it less likely that somebody's going to be pressured those guidelines are also going to make it more difficult for somebody to, to make that choice. And they're worried that it's kind of a slippery slope, right? That it might wind up getting in the way of people's access to abortion, and that it would just it would sort of be a blow to women's autonomy. And it was a very bitter and very kind of interesting, tense fight between these groups that was never really resolved. But the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse actually was more successful. Like, they won, even when they had those, even when they had that opposition. Next slide. So, and then by the later 1970s, they actually grow the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse was really a small kind of local New York thing, but they grow into this larger group called the Committee for Abortion Rights and Against Sterilization Abuse, or CARASA. And that organization, it's the first one that links the abortion rights issue with the issue of sterilization abuse. And actually, it starts to go a lot further than that. So the members of this group are Rodriguez Trias and her buddies from CESA, as well as a whole lot of white feminists, some of them left of center feminists or socialist feminists, some of them not. And they're the first people who are joining what I would consider sort of both sides of the coin, right? Reproductive justice on one side of the coin, and then reproductive rights on the other side, or abortion rights on one side of the coin, and sterilization abuse, and a whole lot of other things on the other side of the coin. They start to think about, starting with sterilization abuse, which is it's like the most literal biological way that somebody could be prevented from making a choice about having a child, if they might want to have a child, right? But if you get a sterilization against your will, or you're kind of pressured or coerced into sterilization, that denies you the ability to make that choice to have a child, to bear a child or raise a child, right? So they start thinking more broadly about, like, what would it mean to have a political agenda that would allow people to choose to have kids? And that was the seed of what today we call reproductive justice. So they didn't yet have that terminology. They had this other terminology of reproductive freedom, which is basically the same thing. And they say reproductive freedom is the possibility of people who can get pregnant, or women, controlling for themselves in a real and practical way, that is, free from economic, social, or legal coercion, whether and under what conditions they will have children. They say there are two sides of what they call reproduction control. One is restrictions on opportunities to have children, and then the other is restrictions on the ability to refrain from having children, right? And they start to articulate, why it's important to look at both sides of that coin. And they're the first ones who do it. And I should say, they don't last as an organization. They do spawn, they start in New York, and then they spawn a national group called the Reproductive Rights National Network, which gets a lot of, not a lot of individual members, but a lot of other organizations kind of join it in a collaborative way. And it's very hard for them to sustain it. It's all done sort of on a shoestring, and they don't have any budgets or professional staff or anything. So they sort of die out by the middle 1980s. But this agenda of theirs, what they call reproductive freedom, what is later called reproductive justice, that's picked up again in the 1990s by black feminists, and in the early 21st century by black feminists, and also by a lot of other feminists of color, who start saying, again, we need to look at both sides of the coin. We can't just look at abortion rights kind of in a vacuum. Next slide. So I'm going to go through this kind of fast, but I did want to underline some of the things that I discovered in the course of doing this project. And the first is just that there were so many feminisms, as I put it here, so many different kinds of feminism that were really active here, which I hadn't necessarily anticipated, and they all were important in the story. This is a little bit of graffiti that says, "End lesbian oppression," from the period I'm writing about, from the early 80s. And this photo was taken by somebody who was in CARASA, And while she's in Carrasa doing this reproductive rights work, she also comes out as a lesbian and comes out into a very politicized lesbian feminist movement. And I didn't think I was writing about lesbian feminism, but turns out that's also part of this story. And I discovered, like, wow, there's very little written about that. Like, we really need more scholarship about that. And the same thing with these people who were very left-wing, these socialist feminists, almost nothing written about them. So I just started to see how important they were, even though there were like a tiny number of people in this period. They were very active and very activist, and I just scratched the surface of starting to tell some of those stories. Some of these people, the woman who took this photo, and a few others, also they stayed in politics even when these groups kind of died out in the 80s, and some of them became very important in the gay movement and in the AIDS movement, like in the organization ACT UP in New York that became the militant wing of the AIDS movement. I also learned a lot about the National Organization for Women. It's much more interesting than I thought it was. It's really complex. There's a million campaigns going on. I think historians haven't done a great job of really, I don't know, I was getting the feeling by the end of the book, like the historians just haven't done a good job of like illuminating the incredible drama that was the high point of the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s. In which, so many opportunities and visions of the future were really on the table. And so many people with, diverse ideas about that were in the mix. I found some of the kind of classic women's liberation groups who were involved in their consciousness raising. They were also part of this story. Sometimes we think about them as being not interested in law and legislation and policy and stuff like that. One of the interesting things I found is that they were interested in public policy. When it was the issue of reproductive rights, they got involved. Like, they got involved in this campaign in New York. And then I also found a really remarkable and very untold story of these Puerto Rican feminists, these people who are fighting against empire and fighting against the United States, and its activities in Puerto Rico. Well, it turns out that also becomes one of the sources of creativity in the feminist movement, which is something that I never expected to find. Next one. I also I learned a lot about law and legal change and how these people, were able to make legal change and policy change. And in some ways it's inspiring, and in some ways it's intimidating. I think usually when we talk about, law in this area, we talk about Roe v. Wade. That's appropriate. Roe is really important. It was really important. Losing Roe obviously has been a devastating thing. But I found that people were able to do a lot of work and even win big victories before Roe versus Wade, like this New York victory. And then after Roe, then we see people like Helen Rodriguez-Trias and her colleagues saying, even when Roe was good law, it wasn't enough, because they were looking at what's happening to, Black women and Puerto Rican women and poor women, and others who are experiencing sterilization abuse and who don't have basic health care. So even though I've been very involved in what happened to the fate of Roe v. Wade and the fate of reproductive rights since Roe was overturned, I also got really persuaded that Roe was not the only game in town, and that in some ways we overemphasize Roe. And I think what happens when we overemphasize Roe is that we forget that, that the real progress came from people organizing kind of at the grassroots, and working with their local legislators the way my mom did, working with doctors and hospital systems the way Helen did, and doing that kind of patient, from the bottom up kind of work. And I found also that people, there was a lot that they could do, and I think there's a lot we can do outside of the courts, right? So these are people who, they worked in the state legislatures. Of course, people are doing that today. They worked through regulations, like the regulations that managed the hospital system in New York around sterilization. They worked at the local neighborhood level, they worked at the city level, they worked at the state level, right? They worked at the county level, they worked at every possible level of our very divided, very complex government. And I think that's good news in that, you really learn that it's possible to make progress, even when the federal courts are not on your side, and, right, or even when the national government is kind of, seems like it's stuck in gridlock and we can't get anything done there. But at the same time, it just means that there are a million different places where change can happen, and also where change can be reversed, right? So it's, I think it's the good news and the bad news, that there are a million opportunities and a million locations where this kind of politics and this kind of legal change can happen, did happen, does happen. Okay, next one. So I'm just finishing up. So what now? Maybe the message of this slide isn't very subtle. As you probably know, Roe versus Wade was overturned in June of 2022, and the Dobbs versus Jackson opinion, decision from the United States Supreme Court that removed the national constitutional protection for abortion access, and returned us to a situation that is very much like the one that I chronicle in the book, where these decisions are being made at the state level to a great degree, where in some states abortion has again been criminalized, whether for the person seeking the abortion or whether for the medical provider who's performing it. And we've returned to a situation to some degree where, where individual doctors and hospitals and clinics become gatekeepers, so that people aren't able to make these decisions for themselves, but they have to appeal and, get somebody else, some kind of medical gatekeeper, to say, your situation means that you're in a desperate enough situation that you can have an abortion. There may be more bad stuff coming. I don't know, but certainly when Alabama's Supreme Court said that it was a crime under the state constitution to destroy fertilized embryos in the IVF process, and suggested that there was something like fetal personhood, i.e. constitutional rights for fetuses that have not yet been born. That seemed to ring a concerning bell about a possible next stage of this politics. There also is a big case that's going to be argued at the United States Supreme Court on Tuesday of next week, March 26th. I refer to it as the mifepristone case. It's a case considering the Food and Drug Administration's regulations for one of two drugs that's used in the medication abortion protocol, as it's called. So mifepristone is the first of the two drugs. There are two questions before the Supreme Court. One is whether the FDA is going to have to change its regulatory guidance and make it a little more restrictive, and that would potentially be consequential in itself. And then the other question is about the Comstock Act of 1873, which forbids the use of the mails for sending what was called, quote unquote, obscene material. And yeah, it's it's a law from a long time ago that was used in very different circumstances, which in theory the Supreme Court might decide to breathe new life into. And if they do that, I'm not exactly sure what the implications are. They could be extremely dire. Like, it could be very hard for anybody who's providing an abortion, and any clinic, any hospital, to get the materials they need to do that work. If the mails and FedEx and UPS and stuff like that are shut down under the Comstock Act. That probably won't happen, but it'll be a real debate at the Supreme Court. So what's happening? We're having these fights in every single legal and political institution, and the good news is, as per what I was just saying a minute ago, there are a million ways that people can engage. Right? The bad news is there are a million ways that things could go south, and it could be very problematic for people who are interested in this kind of medical care. The good news is there are a million ways to engage and to make a difference. Last slide, next one. So, and the last thing I just want to say and to remember, coming out of this book that I wrote, is that I know it's very, very hard, right? We're in a moment, for people who care about these issues, we're in a moment where it just seems like the house is on fire and our hair is on fire, and we're disoriented because things have changed so much in such a short space of time. But I want to keep that challenge, that kind of inspiring vision, that aspirational vision of reproductive justice still in our view. And I think that we'd be making a mistake if our approach was to just kind of hunker down and say, like, oh, I don't have time for the inspiring aspirational vision right now, because I just got to focus on this one thing. What I've learned in studying this history is that people have done that in the past, the hunkering down, and I don't think the hunkering down has really helped us that much. So yeah, the way I put it here was as a question: when abortion and contraception are in peril, as they seem to be right now, will reproductive rights supporters, people like the folks I worked with on the Planned Parenthood board here in Vermont, will they fight for reproductive freedom or reproductive justice? Like, will they hunker down, or will they remember that, reproductive freedom and reproductive justice are still important? The big vision is also still important. Will we continue to fight poverty and hunger and discrimination as part of our reproductive justice agenda? Will we fight for healthcare, safe neighborhoods, decent housing? And, in this time, years after the shock of what happened to George Floyd and to Black women like Breonna Taylor, will whites in particular, white people who are in this movement, will we keep fighting racism as part of our reproductive rights agenda or our reproductive justice agenda? All those are things that I think the history would tell us we're stronger when we aspire to do it all, even when we, can't quite get there. But I wonder, and I would sort of put that challenge to us, that we keep that big agenda in our minds, even in a time when it feels like things are really in trouble. Thanks. Okay. So thoughts, questions, comments? There is this bill called the Women's Health Protection Act that would codify the protections in Roe, and Congress could do it. They could do it any time, right? And if we had the right majority in Congress, then that would be one of the things that we could do. And we should make them. We should also pressure them to do it. And in fact, right now, they could overturn the Comstock Act, and they could take that off the table as something for us to be scared of.
Could you explain that a little bit more?
I'll try. So, the Comstock Act, that was the law under which they put Margaret Sanger in jail, right? And in the early 20th century, they were very aggressive in using the postmasters to to ferret out. I mean, they couldn't open every piece of mail, but they could ferret out material that was, and at the time it was mostly giving people information about birth control. So what was Margaret Sanger doing? She wasn't performing abortions. What she was sending in the mail was information for women about their bodies and how their bodies work, and about different things that they could use so that they could limit their number of pregnancies, right? And that was considered obscene, and criminalized, right? So first Sanger's sister went to jail, and then Sanger left the country, and then ultimately she was prosecuted. We all thought, people who do, who women's history, teach women's history, we thought that it was kind of a dead letter, because there was a case in the 1930s, a case called the United States versus one package of Japanese pessaries. A fantastically named Supreme Court case, or a federal appellate case. And it was about some birth control that was coming in from Japan through the port of New York. And, and the federal appeals court said that as long as a doctor, in their good medical judgment, thought that this was medically appropriate, then it couldn't be criminalized. And so, medical authority was put in place of the Comstock Act. At least that's what I thought. But in recent years, the anti-abortion movement has developed a whole theory around how that's not true, and the Comstock Act, they say, is still good law. It was never repealed. It was never, replaced. And so they're not trying to touch contraception, at least not yet, because the Supreme Court ruled on that in 1965. So that's kind of settled, sort of. But they're claiming that they can use the Comstock Act to forbid anybody from mailing, the drugs that are used in a medication abortion procedure, or even anything else a doctor might use, for that purpose. So I don't know. I have a very smart colleague who's a law professor who says that they could just make it impossible for you to have a clinic if you can't get anything. Apparently there are rulings that say it's not just the U.S. Postal Service; it would also be FedEx and UPS, and basically making things travel by any means. So yeah, there's a real risk in that. And it's going to depend on how terrible the judges are, right? How far out are they? How far do they want to take us back into the past? I'm sorry. Yeah, Jacob.
Thank you again for this presentation. Definitely a lot of history to go through, and I was curious if you could speak a little bit on kind of Caruso founding kind of that term of reproductive justice, and how did that play into the international women's movement? And did it take longer to take on overseas or in South America, or kind of how did that kind of play out?
Well, actually, there's another piece of this story that I only got to tell a little tiny bit, which they do connect to people around the world. And it does take a little while, but by the 90s, so I followed out what happened to Dr. Rodriguez-Trias, and, she continues to be very prominent in the medical profession. She becomes the president of the American Public Health Association, and she winds up representing that organization in Cairo at a global meeting in 1994. And what they do in Cairo is they basically do reproductive freedom on a global scale. They don't have that language, but they talk about the need to support women's health, not just to try and get women in poor countries to have fewer babies. There was kind of a global consensus about population control and how that was so important, and that was the only reason that people in third world countries ever got access to contraception, was because somebody in a first world country thought that they needed to have fewer kids, and so they would do population control. So what happens in Cairo is they push back against the population control idea, and they say that no, people should have access to contraception because they should have autonomy and liberty and freedom, and they should also have access to basic health care and all the things that are going to improve the quality of their lives beyond just, trying to limit their birth rate. So it actually does become very important, and they do get connected to people around the world. There's a whole series of meetings sponsored by the UN. There are international women's meetings. Ultimately there's that one in Beijing in '95, but there's a bunch in the '80s too, and they're all involved in that. And then there's also these meetings on population that these people are involved in. And that's another way in which they're very, very important. And that's another thing that, frankly, I'm a little scared of, that people they're gonna bring back the idea of population control, from the '70s or '80s. If we don't keep this kind of conversation alive about how problematic that is. Yeah. Yeah. Is that it? Okay. Well, I'm always happy to talk. You can always find me at the University of Vermont in the history department. Even if you can't remember how to spell my name, there aren't that many of us, so you should be able to, there's my name. You should be able to find me pretty easily, and I'm always happy to be in conversation about these issues. So thanks a lot for coming out.
And you have a breakfast in the Vermont room?
Oh, nice.
Did any of my students come? Do we have any Zoomers?
Yeah, we had like a good, 20 or so.